What if the most protected birth in modern royal history never actually happened the way we were told? That's not an accusation. It's not a conclusion. It's a question. And it's a question that, until recently, most people wouldn't even allow themselves to form. Not because the evidence wasn't there, but because the idea itself felt forbidden. Off limits. Almost rude. Yet here we are. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because something unusual happened. Quietly. Carefully. Not with tabloid banners or anonymous blog posts. But with language that doesn't belong to gossip at all. Language that belongs to institutions that normally say nothing. Institutions that survive by staying silent. And when those institutions speak, even indirectly, it's never by accident. Let me slow this down. This story didn't explode the way scandals usually do. There was no viral clip at first. No screaming headline that forced its way into your feed. It arrived sideways. In fragments. In oddly specific phrasing. In questions that weren't answered, but also weren't shut down. And that's the part that should make you sit up a little straighter. Because if something is untrue at this level, it doesn't linger. It's denied. Firmly. Cleanly. With paperwork. With timelines. With confidence. That didn't happen here. Instead, what followed was hesitation. Careful wording. And a sense that people were choosing each sentence as if it might be read back to them later. Why would that be? Ask yourself something simple. When was the last time intelligence-linked sources allowed a rumor involving a member of the royal family to circulate without a definitive shutdown? Not a vague dismissal. Not no comment. An actual, categorical correction. It didn't come. And that absence matters more than any wild claim ever could. Because this isn't about believing something shocking. It's about noticing something missing. This story matters now, not because of who it involves, but because of how it surfaced. The timing, the tone, the level at which the conversation suddenly shifted. This wasn't resurrected history. This wasn't someone digging up old blog posts or reinterpreting interviews from years ago. This emerged in the present tense. In a moment when institutions are already fragile, when public trust is thin, when questions about truth, narrative control, and institutional credibility are no longer theoretical. And suddenly, a very specific phrase entered the conversation. Not a nickname, not an insult, a term. And once you notice that, it becomes harder to ignore the rest. Let's be clear about something before we go any further. This is not a story about attacking a child. It's not even a story about attacking a mother. Anyone trying to reduce it to that is either misunderstanding it or deliberately flattening it. This is a story about verification, about how reality is documented when the stakes are high, about how institutions protect themselves when something doesn't fit neatly into protocol, and about what happens when the public starts to sense that the version of events they were asked to accept might be incomplete. Because that's the emotional core of this. Not outrage, not mockery, unease. That low-level discomfort that creeps in when you realize you were told to stop asking questions before you ever understood why. Think back to the coverage at the time. The emphasis on privacy. The insistence on boundaries. The framing that any curiosity was cruelty. That asking for details was invasive, even dangerous. And to a point, that argument made sense. Everyone deserves dignity. Everyone deserves safety. But here's the contradiction that no one really resolved. This wasn't a private citizen. This was a royal-adjacent birth with constitutional implications. Lineage matters in that context. Documentation matters. Verification isn't gossip, it's governance. So why did the usual processes feel blurred? Why were standard confirmations treated as optional? Why did the language around the event keep shifting, subtly, over time? You might remember how certain details appeared, disappeared, then reappeared slightly altered. How some statements were definitive in one interview, then strangely abstract in another. How official records were referenced, but rarely shown. At the time, most people shrugged it off. The world was loud. There were bigger crises. And frankly, questioning a birth feels uncomfortable. Almost taboo. That taboo is powerful. And it works. Until it doesn't. Because institutions don't operate on discomfort. They operate on risk. And at some point, someone somewhere decided that the risk of silence was greater than the risk of controlled exposure. That's when the tone changed. Not dramatically, not publicly at first, just enough for people who know how to read these things to notice. A careful acknowledgement here, a refusal to dismiss there, and then That phrase. The one that doesn't belong in a fairy tale or a smear campaign. The one that belongs in a classification system. I want you to consider this. Intelligence agencies don't speculate about personal matters. They don't trade in metaphor. When they refer to something, they do it precisely, because precision protects them later. So why would a term that implies substitution, representation rather than origin, ever enter the same orbit as a royal birth? That's not a question with an easy answer. And it's not one we're going to rush. Because rushing is how stories like this get dismissed. Instead, we're going to sit with the discomfort. With the gaps. With the things that don't quite align when you lay them out slowly, side by side, without shouting. This isn't about proving something outrageous. It's about understanding why proving the opposite suddenly feels more complicated than it should be. Ask yourself another question. If nothing unusual happened, why has no one simply walked the public through the process, step by step, in a way that closes the door permanently? Why does the explanation always stop just short of finality? Why does it rely so heavily on trust rather than documentation? Trust is powerful, but institutions don't run on trust alone. They run on records. And when records are clean, they're shown. When they're not, you get silence, or deflection, or moral framing that shifts the conversation away from facts and toward feelings. That's not accidental. This is where the emotional stakes deepen. Because once people sense that they were asked to suspend scrutiny, not temporarily, but indefinitely, it changes the relationship between the public and the story. It becomes less about what happened and more about why certain questions were framed as unacceptable in the first place. And once that door cracks open, it doesn't close easily. This is why this story refuses to stay buried. Not because it's salacious, but because it touches something deeper. The fear that narratives can be managed so tightly that truth becomes secondary to stability. And stability, as history shows us, is often protected right up until the moment it collapses. Now, I want to be careful here. Careful with language. Careful with implication. Nothing you're about to hear is presented as settled fact. It's presented as a sequence of anomalies, of procedural deviations, of linguistic tells that raise eyebrows among people trained to notice such things. And that's important, because the fastest way to lose credibility is to overstate. So instead, we're going to understate, and let the weight build on its own. Because what comes next isn't one big revelation. It's a pattern, and patterns are harder to dismiss. It starts with a press moment that wasn't supposed to be one. Not a dramatic announcement, not a headline-grabbing confession, just a setting, a presence, a willingness to let certain questions exist in public space without shutting them down. And in the world of intelligence, that alone is a signal. Signals are how these stories really begin. And once you see that signal, you can't unsee what followed. Because after that moment, the conversation shifted from "this is absurd" to "this is sensitive." And those two things are not the same. Absurd claims are laughed away. Sensitive matters are handled quietly. And that distinction, that's where everything starts to change. But what came next would change the entire tone of the story, and almost no one noticed it happening in real time. Intelligence agencies don't hold press conferences over rumors. That sentence alone should slow you down. Because when people imagine press conferences, they picture podiums, microphones, bold statements, officials leaning into certainty. Intelligence work doesn't look like that. It's quieter, more guarded. When it surfaces publicly, it's usually because something has gone wrong, or because silence has become more dangerous than speech. So when this story traces back not to a tabloid leak, not to a disgruntled insider live streaming from a kitchen table, but to a carefully staged, carefully worded appearance linked to intelligence channels, the entire frame changes. This wasn't spectacle. It was calibration. And that's what makes the first chapter of this story so unsettling. Not what was said, but the fact that something was said at all. Let's reconstruct the moment, because details matter here. There was no dramatic announcement. No banner headline that screamed revelation. The setting itself was almost deliberately dull. Neutral walls, sparse language, a format that suggested briefing, not performance. And most importantly, a tone that avoided emotional charge altogether. That absence of emotion is itself a tell. People who want attention amplify. People who want control minimize. And the language used that day, measured, clipped, almost evasive, wasn't designed to convince the public of anything. It was designed to acknowledge something without defining it. Why would that be necessary? Ask yourself what intelligence agencies normally do when faced with misinformation. They don't entertain it. They don't contextualize it. They shut it down or they ignore it completely. There is no middle ground. Unless the information intersects with something real. That doesn't mean true. It means consequential. And here's where things start to feel off. Journalists present that day noticed it immediately, even if they didn't articulate it in their coverage. The questions weren't framed as, is this true or false? They were framed as, are you aware of this narrative? And does this pose any concern? That's a subtle but crucial distinction. Concern is not truth testing. Concern is risk assessment. Risk to whom? Institutions don't assess risk based on gossip alone. They assess it based on exposure, leverage, and credibility. And that suggests that whatever prompted this appearance wasn't being treated as a joke behind closed doors. Still, nothing explicit was offered. No confirmation. No denial. Just space. Space for the question to exist. That's rare. Think about how often intelligence-linked officials choose to say no comment. That phrase is blunt. Final. It shuts the door. What happened here was different. The responses were longer than necessary. More explanatory than expected. Almost as if they were trying to guide the conversation without controlling it outright. Why guide instead of close? Because closing might require certainty they didn't want to claim publicly. And that's where the first crack appears. At one point, a journalist pressed, not aggressively, but persistently, about whether any internal review had been triggered by the circulating claims. The answer was careful. Too careful. It acknowledged awareness. It referenced internal processes, but it stopped short of saying there was nothing to review. That omission is not accidental. If there were nothing to review, that sentence would have been easy, comfortable, reassuring. Instead, it hung there, incomplete. And people who understand bureaucratic language felt it immediately. That sensation you get when a sentence ends just before the word you were expecting. Like someone stepping away from a cliff edge at the last second. The room felt it. And then came the phrasing that would ripple outward long after the microphones were turned off. A reference, not elaborated on, to representational anomalies. Those words didn't make headlines. They didn't trend. Most people missed them entirely. But for those listening closely, they were seismic. Because representation implies substitution. It implies something standing in for something else. And while that can apply to many contexts, legal, symbolic, procedural, it does not belong anywhere near a biological event unless something has gone sideways. Why use that word? Why not say misinformation? Why not say fabrication? Why not say hoax? Because those words close doors. Representation opens one. The officials never explained it. They didn't have to. In intelligence communication, sometimes the message isn't in the explanation. It's in the vocabulary chosen. And that vocabulary suggested that whatever was under discussion wasn't being dismissed as fantasy. It was being categorized. Categorization is a dangerous thing when the public isn't supposed to notice. From there, the briefing moved on. Other topics. Other questions. The moment passed. Most outlets summarized it in a sentence or two, if they mentioned it at all. But the damage, or perhaps the signal, had already been sent. Something existed. Something had been acknowledged. And it hadn't been neutralized. Why? This is where the story stops being about a single event and starts being about institutional behavior. Intelligence agencies are deeply conservative organisms. Not politically, structurally. They avoid novelty. They resist uncertainty. And above all, they avoid public embarrassment. If this narrative were entirely baseless, allowing it oxygen would be reckless. It would invite ridicule. It would undermine authority. Unless suppressing it posed a greater risk. That's the calculation no one talks about publicly. Sometimes, denying something draws more attention than acknowledging it quietly. Sometimes, silence is safer than certainty. But that strategy is only used when the underlying issue is complex enough that a clean denial could later be contradicted. That's not speculation. That's standard institutional self-preservation. So what complexity could possibly surround a royal birth years after the fact? That question alone should unsettle you. Because births are usually among the simplest things to verify. Dates, locations, records, witnesses, medical documentation. There is no mystery unless something interrupts the chain. And yet, Here we have an intelligence-level acknowledgement that suggests a chain worth examining. Not concluding. Examining. That distinction matters. Now, before anyone rushes ahead, let's pause. This is not evidence of wrongdoing. It's evidence of caution. And caution appears when clarity is missing. What kind of clarity? That's where the press conference becomes more interesting for what it avoided than for what it addressed. No hospital was named. No process was described. No standard protocol was invoked. The answers stayed abstract, hovering above specifics. And abstraction is a shield. When officials speak abstractly, they protect themselves from being pinned down later. They leave room to adjust, to clarify, to reframe if necessary. That suggests anticipation. Anticipation of what? Of further questions. Because something else happened after that briefing. Quietly, off camera, journalists started asking different questions. Not louder ones. Narrower ones. More technical ones. Questions about process rather than story. And some of those questions reportedly hit walls they hadn't hit before. Requests for clarification were delayed. Responses took longer. Statements were routed through more layers than usual. That's another tell. When an institution believes a matter is trivial, it moves quickly. When it believes a matter could escalate, it slows everything down. Slowing buys time. Time to check records. Time to align messaging. Time to decide how much truth is necessary to release. None of that proves anything, but it sketches a mindset. And mindsets are what investigations are built on. This is also where the emotional tone of the story shifts. Because up to this point, it's procedural, dry, almost boring. But boredom is deceptive. Because behind bureaucratic language are human decisions. And behind those decisions are stakes. Imagine being the person in that room who knows the full file. Who understands exactly why that phrasing was chosen. Who knows which reminder emails went out beforehand, cautioning speakers to stay within certain bounds. Imagine knowing that every word would be parsed later. That's not the posture of someone dismissing nonsense. That's the posture of someone navigating uncertainty. And uncertainty at this level is radioactive. Now ask yourself something else. If the issue were purely personal, purely private, why? Would intelligence agencies touch it at all? They wouldn't. Which means the concern, whatever it is, extends beyond individual behavior. It touches systems. Systems that rely on trust, on verification, on continuity. This is where the story quietly expands beyond one family, one child, one narrative. Because if there is even a possibility, just a possibility, that public records and official acknowledgments diverge from biological reality, that creates vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities to blackmail, to manipulation, to foreign exploitation. Intelligence agencies think in those terms instinctively, not because they enjoy paranoia, but because history rewards caution. And that's why this press moment matters so much. It wasn't loud. It wasn't definitive. But it was a marker that something had crossed from rumor into risk assessment. And once that happens, the machinery starts turning. Files are revisited. Language is reviewed. Assumptions are questioned. And sometimes, in the process, a term surfaces that was never meant for public ears. A term like the one that would soon begin circulating quietly among journalists and analysts alike. A term that doesn't belong in fairy tales or family albums. A term that belongs to classification manuals and internal memos. Because once that word entered the conversation, the story stopped being about whether something happened and started being about how it was represented. And that distinction would change everything. But the implications of that term, those would take time to surface. Because once that word entered the conversation, the tone shifted in a way that's hard to describe unless you've watched it happen before. Not louder, not angrier, quieter, more careful. The term itself didn't arrive with fanfare. It didn't come with an explanation or a definition offered for public consumption. It surfaced indirectly, almost as if it had slipped out of a filing cabinet that wasn't supposed to be opened in daylight. And that's what made it dangerous. Because the moment a term exists, especially one that doesn't belong to everyday language, it invites a different kind of scrutiny. Not emotional scrutiny. Technical scrutiny. The kind that asks not, is this true? But why does this word exist at all? The phrase that began circulating. Again, not officially announced, not highlighted, just present, was Darrell. It sounds absurd at first glance. Almost cartoonish. The kind of thing you'd expect to be dismissed instantly. And that initial reaction is important, because it's precisely why such terms can pass unnoticed if you're not trained to listen for them. Intelligence language often sounds mundane or even strange to outsiders. That's intentional. Obscurity is protection. But here's the problem. Darrell is not a casual phrase. It's not slang. It's not a joke. And it's not something someone improvises on the fly in a serious context. Terms like that exist because they serve a function. So the first question isn't, what does it mean? The first question is, why would anyone need it? In bureaucratic systems, especially ones built around verification and risk, terminology evolves to solve specific problems. A new term appears when an old one no longer fits. When reality presents a scenario that existing language can't neatly describe. That's how classifications are born. So let's slow down again. This is not about asserting that a doll was used. This is about understanding why the idea of a representational object would even be relevant in a discussion touching a royal birth. Because normally, it wouldn't be. Births are biological events. They leave biological trails, medical documentation, witnesses, records that are difficult to falsify at scale, unless something interrupts that chain. An interruption is where representation enters the picture. In intelligence and security contexts, representation can mean many things. A stand-in for a person, a proxy for an asset, a substitute used for protection, deception, or continuity. That doesn't automatically imply wrongdoing. Sometimes representation is used defensively, to protect identities, to manage exposure, to maintain stability. But it always implies that the thing being represented is not physically present in the way it's being portrayed. That's the uncomfortable core. So when a term implying representation appears in proximity to a birth narrative, it raises a question that can't be unasked. Representation of what? And for whom? This is where the story becomes genuinely difficult to navigate, because the implications branch in multiple directions, and none of them are clean. One possibility, purely hypothetical, is that the term refers to a security measure, a controlled environment, a substitute used temporarily to manage risk. Another possibility is bureaucratic shorthand for a discrepancy in records, something that doesn't align, requiring an internal label while it's being resolved. And yes, there is a more provocative interpretation that people leap to immediately. But notice how quickly those interpretations are either amplified or dismissed depending on who benefits from the framing. What's interesting is that no authoritative source rushed to define the term publicly. That silence matters. If a term is being misunderstood in a way that could cause reputational damage, institutions usually clarify quickly. They don't let ambiguity fester, unless clarification itself would create more problems than it solves. Think about that. If you explain the term, you invite follow-up questions. Questions about why it was used, who authorized it, what scenario required it. Sometimes, saying nothing is safer. But saying nothing also signals that there is something to say. This is the paradox intelligence agencies live in constantly. Now, let's talk about how this term began to circulate beyond that initial context. It didn't leak as a headline. It appeared in conversations between journalists, in off-the-record briefings where people compare notes, in moments where someone says, "Have you heard this phrasing?" and the other person goes quiet. Those moments don't make news, but they shape it. And as the term moved quietly through those channels, something else happened. People started revisiting old material, not with fresh outrage, but with new eyes. Interviews were rewatched. Statements were reread. Timelines were laid out side by side, not to prove a theory, but to see if the language still made sense under this new lens. And some of it didn't. This is where the emotional texture of the story changes again. Because up to now, everything could be brushed aside as overinterpretation. But patterns are harder to dismiss. For example, the way language around the birth shifted over time. Early statements emphasized privacy and safety. Later ones emphasized symbolism and joy. Later still, they leaned into abstraction, phrases about arrival and welcoming that avoided physical specificity. Individually, those shifts mean nothing. People change how they speak all the time. But when viewed through the possibility that representation was involved at some point, the language starts to look curated, carefully noncommittal. And that's not a judgment. It's an observation. Because in crisis communication, ambiguity is a tool. It allows multiple interpretations to coexist without forcing a resolution. The question becomes, what crisis was being managed? Now, let's address the obvious pushback here. People will say, and reasonably so, that this is all too thin, that you can't build a serious narrative on phrasing and tone. Normally, they'd be right. But this isn't happening in a vacuum. This is happening in a context where intelligence-linked figures acknowledged awareness of the narrative without dismissing it, where internal processes were referenced but not explained, where a term implying representation surfaced without clarification. That combination is not common. It doesn't happen over celebrity gossip. It happens over risk. And risk, in intelligence terms, is not about embarrassment. It's about leverage. Imagine, for a moment, the worst-case scenario from an institutional perspective. Not that the public would be upset, but that a foreign entity could exploit uncertainty, that a narrative gap could be weaponized, that silence could be interpreted as weakness. In that scenario, you don't rush to deny. You assess. You gather facts. You review records. You decide how much truth can be released without causing greater harm. And sometimes, you allow ambiguity to persist while you do that work. That's uncomfortable for the public, but it's familiar to anyone who's watched intelligence crises unfold before. Here's another detail that deserves attention. No legal action was taken to shut down the discussion at its source. No aggressive injunctions. No sweeping condemnations. Again, that's not how baseless claims are handled when powerful interests are at stake. Baseless claims are crushed. Uncomfortable ones are managed. So where does that leave us? In a space of controlled uncertainty. And controlled uncertainty is fertile ground for speculation, which institutions usually hate, unless speculation itself serves a purpose. Sometimes, allowing the public to argue among themselves diffuses focus. It turns a single sharp question into 1,000 dull ones. Instead of "did this happen?" the conversation becomes "who's crazy? Who's cruel? Who's biased?" Noise replaces inquiry. And that may buy time. Time for what? For internal alignment. Because if there's one thing institutions fear more than public outrage, it's internal contradiction. Different departments telling different stories. Records that don't match. Protocols that were bent quietly and are now being revisited under a harsher light. This is where the term Darrell doll becomes more than a curiosity. It becomes a placeholder. A placeholder for something unresolved. And unresolved issues are the ones intelligence agencies lose sleep over. Now, I want to ask you something directly. If this term were meaningless, if it were a fabrication or a misunderstanding, wouldn't it be safer to say so explicitly? Why allow it to linger? Why let people connect dots at all? Unless the dots can't be disconnected cleanly. That doesn't mean they lead where some people think they do, but it does mean they exist. And once they exist, they demand explanation. But explanation requires records. And records, as we're about to see, are where this story becomes genuinely complicated. Because once journalists and analysts started asking about documentation, about timelines, certifications, witnesses, that's when the walls really went up. Not dramatic walls, procedural ones. Requests took longer. Answers became more generalized. References were made to confidentiality in ways that felt broader than necessary. That's the moment when people who've been around long enough start paying attention. Because confidentiality is usually invoked narrowly. When it's invoked broadly, it often means someone is unsure what can safely be disclosed. And that uncertainty points backward, toward the moment the records were created, toward the decisions made at the time, toward the possibility that something was done expediently, with the assumption that it would never be scrutinized this closely. That assumption may no longer hold. And that's why this story refuses to settle. Not because of outrage. Not because of cruelty, but because a term exists that shouldn't need to exist at all. And once you notice that, you can't help but ask what else exists quietly in the background, waiting for the right moment to surface. Because the next layer of this story isn't about language anymore. It's about timelines. And timelines, unlike words, don't bend easily. But the timeline in this case doesn't just bend. It resists alignment. And that's where the real questions begin. Timelines don't care about narratives. They don't respond to emotion. They don't bend for symbolism or intention. They either align or they don't. And when they don't, no amount of careful phrasing can fully smooth the edges. That's why timelines are always where stories like this either collapse or become something else entirely. Up until now, everything we've talked about could still live in the realm of tone, language, and institutional behavior. Interesting, yes. Suggestive, certainly. But still abstract enough to dismiss if you wanted to. Timelines don't give you that luxury. Because once you start laying events out in sequence, dates, statements, appearances, absences, you're no longer debating interpretation. You're comparing reality against itself. And that's where things begin to feel uncomfortable. Let's start with something basic. In any high-profile birth, especially one with constitutional relevance, the timeline is usually overdocumented. Hospitals issue confirmations. Medical professionals are named or at least acknowledged. There are witnesses. There are protocols designed specifically to remove doubt. Historically, those protocols exist for one reason: continuity. They are meant to eliminate ambiguity before it has a chance to grow. So the first question people began asking wasn't provocative at all. It was procedural. Where is the unbroken chain? Not the press release. Not the congratulatory statements. The actual sequence of verifiable steps that take you from pregnancy to birth to official recognition. And when analysts began reconstructing that chain, they noticed something subtle but persistent. There were overlaps that shouldn't overlap. Gaps that were explained emotionally rather than administratively. Moments where language replaced logistics. That's not inherently sinister, but it is unusual. For example, consider how the date of birth was discussed publicly. Not the date itself, but the way it was framed. Sometimes it was anchored firmly. Other times it was referenced obliquely, almost as an afterthought, wrapped in sentiment rather than specificity. Why does that matter? Because dates are anchors. Institutions cling to them. They are the easiest thing to confirm and the hardest thing to dispute. And yet, here, they seemed fluid. Then there's the matter of location. Again, not gossip, not speculation. Simply the question of where documentation originates. In most cases, that answer is straightforward. Even when privacy is invoked, institutions can and do confirm that protocols were followed without revealing personal details. Here, the confirmation existed, but it was strangely indirect. Statements referred to standard procedures without naming them, to appropriate medical care without contextualizing it, to safety and privacy, as if those concepts themselves were substitutes for verification. Privacy can coexist with clarity. It often does. So why did clarity feel elusive here? This is where some people begin to get defensive. Because asking these questions feels accusatory, even when it's not meant to be. But discomfort doesn't invalidate inquiry. Especially when the stakes are institutional. Another detail that began to attract attention was the timing of announcements versus events. Normally, announcements lag events by a predictable margin. There's a rhythm to these things. Information moves through channels, gets approved, then released. In this case, the rhythm felt irregular. Some announcements appeared unusually delayed. Others appeared almost preemptive, arriving before certain confirmations would typically be finalized. Again, each instance alone is explainable. Together, they form a pattern that resists easy explanation. And patterns are where analysts live. This is also where the conversation quietly shifted among those following closely. It moved away from "did this happen?" and toward "why does this feel administratively messy?" Messiness is not criminal, but it is revealing, because institutions strive for cleanliness in their records, especially when they know those records may one day be scrutinized. So what would cause that cleanliness to falter? One answer is chaos. Another is expediency. Sometimes decisions are made quickly, under pressure, with the assumption that they won't be revisited. And sometimes those decisions make sense in the moment, but create complications later. That's not an accusation. It's human nature. But intelligence agencies exist precisely to anticipate those downstream complications. Which brings us back to why this ever caught their attention at all. Imagine being an analyst tasked with reviewing potential vulnerabilities tied to high-profile figures. You're not looking for scandal. You're looking for weak points. Areas where uncertainty could be exploited. You pull the file. You skim the timeline. And you notice that certain confirmations rely heavily on trust rather than documentation. That doesn't mean something is wrong, but it does mean something is unverifiable. And unverifiable elements are dangerous in intelligence terms. Because if you can't independently confirm something, someone else might claim they can. That's how leverage is born. This is where the phrase, "not from her body," which began circulating in certain corners, becomes less about shock and more about semantics. It's a brutal phrase. It lands hard. But strip away the emotion, and what it's really pointing to is origin. Origin matters in records. If an event's origin is unclear or indirect, institutions need to account for that ambiguity. Sometimes with footnotes, sometimes with internal classifications, sometimes with terms that were never meant for public ears. That's where representation enters again, not as a sensational claim, but as a bureaucratic solution, a way of saying, this is how the event is recognized, even if its physical specifics are not directly documented in the usual way. That's uncomfortable to even consider. And to be clear, it's still hypothetical. But the timeline anomalies create space for that hypothesis to exist. And that space is what institutions dislike most. Now, let's talk about witnesses. In traditional royal protocol, witnesses are part of the process, not to intrude, but to verify, to ensure that records reflect reality accurately. In this case, the public narrative emphasized modernity, a break from tradition, a desire for normalcy. That framing is understandable, even admirable. But breaks from tradition don't eliminate the need for verification. They just shift how it's achieved. So the question becomes, what replaced the traditional safeguards? The answer, publicly, was trust. Trust in statements. Trust in assurances. Trust in privacy. Trust is not a document. And intelligence agencies don't operate on trust alone. This is why the timeline matters so much. Because when trust replaces verification, the record becomes vulnerable. And vulnerability attracts attention. As people continued to map out the sequence of events, another oddity emerged. The way subsequent references to the birth became increasingly symbolic. Language leaned into themes of joy, resilience, new beginnings. All beautiful, all human, but conspicuously light on logistics. It's as if the story moved deliberately away from the physical and toward the abstract. Why would that be necessary? Unless the physical details were the very thing someone wanted to avoid reopening. This doesn't prove anything, but it suggests strategy, a strategy of narrative insulation. And strategies are rarely deployed unless there's something to protect. At this point, it's worth asking yourself, if everything were straightforward, why not simply release a clean, minimal confirmation that closes the loop? Not a spectacle, not a violation of privacy, just enough to remove doubt. The fact that this hasn't happened, years later, is what keeps this story alive. Not because people want to believe something shocking, but because doubt, once introduced, demands resolution. And here's the most unsettling part. The longer doubt lingers, the more valuable it becomes to those who might exploit it. That's the intelligence perspective, which brings us back, yet again, to that press moment, to the careful language, to the refusal to dismiss. Those choices make sense if the timeline is imperfect, if there are decisions in the past that can't be undone, only managed. Because sometimes the truth isn't explosive enough to reveal, but too unstable to ignore. And when that happens, institutions don't rush. They wait. They assess. They decide how much uncertainty the system can tolerate. The question now is whether that tolerance is wearing thin. Because timelines don't age well when they're misaligned. They attract scrutiny. They invite reinterpretation. They draw in people who weren't interested before. And once that process starts, it rarely stops on its own. Which is why the next phase of this story doesn't focus on dates or words at all. It focuses on paper, on records, redactions, and the places where ink simply stops. And that's where things become genuinely difficult to explain away. But to understand that, we need to follow the trail from narrative to documentation. And that trail is anything but straightforward. Paper is where stories either end or refuse to. Because paper doesn't argue back. It doesn't get offended. It doesn't respond to narrative pressure. It either exists in full or it doesn't. And when it doesn't, the absence speaks in a way no interview ever could. This is the point in stories like this where the energy usually spikes, where people expect a dramatic reveal, a document slammed onto a desk, a headline that promises everything at once. That's not how this works. This part is quieter, slower, and honestly, more unnerving. Because when journalists and analysts began shifting their focus away from interviews and timelines and toward documentation, They weren't looking for proof of a theory. They were looking for closure, for the kind of administrative neatness that allows everyone to move on. What they found instead was friction, not open resistance, not outright refusal, just enough procedural drag to make simple questions feel complicated. You have to understand how unusual that is. In most high-profile cases, especially ones that have already attracted scrutiny, institutions are eager to tidy up loose ends. They want the file to be boring. Boring is safe. Here, boring never quite arrived. The first thing people noticed was how often the word confidentiality appeared and how broadly it was applied. Confidentiality is normal in medical contexts, of course. No one disputes that. But confidentiality usually has edges. It protects specific details while allowing general verification. Here, it seemed to swallow everything. Requests for confirmation weren't denied outright. They were acknowledged, then rerouted. Clarifications were promised, then deferred. Statements were issued that referenced records without describing them. That kind of language isn't accidental. It's designed to signal cooperation while buying time. Time for what? That's the question that lingers. Because if the records are clean, time works in your favor. You can afford to be transparent. Delay only fuels suspicion, unless delay is necessary because transparency itself is complicated. This is where redactions enter the story. Redactions are not, by themselves, suspicious. They're a standard tool. Sensitive names, locations, medical identifiers, all routinely obscured. What raised eyebrows here was the scope. Sections that would normally be summarized were simply absent, not blacked out, not partially visible, just not there. And absence is harder to justify than obscurity. When something is redacted, you're told it exists but can't be shown. When something is missing, you're left to wonder whether it ever existed in the expected form. That distinction matters, because institutions know that redactions can be challenged. Missing material is harder to interrogate. You can't ask to see what's not acknowledged. This is where experienced reporters start to feel that familiar tension in the back of their necks. The sense that the file they're being shown is not the full file. Not because of malice. Sometimes because of precedent. If a decision was made years ago to handle something informally, retroactively formalizing it can expose the original choice as irregular. And irregularity, even if benign, can be politically radioactive. So you avoid it. You lean on confidentiality. You emphasize privacy. You allow the narrative to drift toward emotion and symbolism, away from process. Again, none of this proves anything, but it paints a picture of caution layered on top of caution. Another thing that quietly troubled people was how often answers referenced appropriate authorities without naming them. That phrase sounds reassuring. It implies oversight, structure, control, but it's also wonderfully vague. Appropriate according to whom? Authority over what? Normally, such phrases are accompanied by at least a general framework, a department, a protocol, something concrete. Here, the framework remained hazy, and haziness is rarely accidental in bureaucratic communication. Think about it from the inside. Imagine you're tasked with responding to inquiries about a matter that touches personal privacy, institutional reputation, and public trust all at once. You want to be careful. You don't want to lie, but you also don't want to open doors that can't be closed again. So you speak in layers. You refer to process without describing it. You acknowledge oversight without detailing it. You create the impression of solidity without offering handles. That's what seems to have happened here. As the months went on, and then years, the paper trail didn't become clearer. It became more distant. References to documentation receded. The story hardened into something almost mythic, emotionally rich, procedurally thin. And that's a strange outcome for an event that should have been administratively straightforward. Some observers began to wonder whether the issue wasn't that records didn't exist, but that they didn't exist in the form people expected. That's a subtle but crucial difference. Records can exist that are incomplete, or provisional, or created after the fact to formalize something that was initially handled informally. Those records are real, but they carry risk, because they can be challenged. This is where the intelligence angle becomes relevant again. From a risk assessment perspective, the question isn't, is this morally acceptable? It's, is this exploitable? An incomplete paper trail is exploitable. A reliance on trust is exploitable. Ambiguity is exploitable. And exploitation doesn't require the underlying story to be true in the way people imagine. It only requires uncertainty. That's why intelligence agencies care about paperwork in ways the public rarely sees. They understand that documentation is armor. And when armor has gaps, even small ones, they matter. This brings us back to why no definitive clarification has ever been issued. Because definitive clarification requires definitive records. And if those records contain qualifiers, footnotes, or internal classifications that were never meant to be public, releasing them could create more questions than it answers. So you don't. You let time pass. You hope interest fades. You rely on the fact that most people don't want to sit with discomfort for long. And for a while, that strategy worked. But then the narrative shifted again. Not because of a new leak. Not because of a whistleblower stepping forward. But because institutions elsewhere began facing similar questions about transparency, trust, and documentation. The cultural context changed. Suddenly, people were less willing to accept because we said so as an answer. They wanted to understand how decisions were made, not just what decisions were announced. And that renewed appetite for process cast old stories in a new light. This one included. At that point, the missing pieces in the paper trail became harder to ignore. Why? For example, had no neutral third-party verification ever been publicly referenced in a way that closed the loop? Why did every explanation ultimately circle back to trust? Trust is powerful, but it's also fragile. And fragile things attract scrutiny. This is also where some insiders reportedly became uneasy. Not because they believed a particular theory, but because they recognized the vulnerability. When a story rests too heavily on narrative and not enough on documentation, it becomes a liability. And liabilities don't have to be true to be dangerous. They just have to be plausible enough for someone else to use. That's the uncomfortable calculus behind all of this. It's not about proving something sensational. It's about acknowledging that the way this was handled left open questions that now can't be neatly closed. And once those questions exist, institutions have to decide whether to confront them or continue managing around them. So far, management has won. But management strategies have a shelf life. Especially when new generations of journalists, analysts, and citizens start asking not what happened, but how do we know? That's a harder question to deflect, and it's one that leads directly into the next layer of this story. Because once paperwork becomes an issue, silence becomes strategic. And strategic silence doesn't happen in isolation. It's reinforced by media choices, by what gets amplified, by what gets framed as cruel to ask, and by who benefits when the conversation shifts away from verification and toward morality. That's where the lens widens again, away from files and forms, toward the ecosystem that protected the narrative when the paper couldn't. And that ecosystem is far more powerful and far more revealing than any single document could ever be. But to understand that, we have to look at who spoke, who didn't, and why some questions were quietly labeled unacceptable long before anyone could explain exactly what they were protecting. And once you see that pattern, it becomes very difficult to unsee. The loudest stories are often the ones hiding the quietest truths. And that's not an accusation aimed at journalists. It's an observation about systems, about incentives, about how information moves when something is sensitive enough that no one wants to be the person who handles it the wrong way. Because once the paper trail stops offering clarity and institutions retreat into careful language, the next layer of protection isn't legal or procedural. It's narrative. This is the point where the story stops being about documents and starts being about amplification. About what questions get repeated and which ones quietly disappear. About how certain lines of inquiry become framed not as investigative, but as inappropriate. And that shift rarely happens by accident. Media ecosystems are not neutral spaces. They respond to pressure, to access, to reputational risk. When a subject is deemed radioactive, coverage doesn't stop, but it changes shape. You stop seeing, how does this work, and start seeing why this is harmful to discuss. That's a powerful pivot, because it moves the conversation away from verification and into morality. And morality is much harder to argue with. Look back at how this topic was treated whenever it surfaced, not just by tabloids or fringe outlets, but by mainstream platforms that normally pride themselves on skepticism. The framing was consistent. Questioning the story was described as cruel, as invasive, as conspiratorial, as an attack rather than an inquiry. And again, on a human level, that framing makes sense. No one wants to be associated with cruelty, especially toward a child. But notice what that framing does. It collapses all questions into a single category. It removes the distinction between mockery and verification, between bad faith and procedural curiosity. Once that happens, the safest move for most journalists is silence. Not because they're convinced of anything, but because the cost of being wrong, or even being misunderstood, becomes too high. Access matters in media. So does credibility. If asking a certain question risks both, most people won't ask it. That's not cowardice. It's survival. This is where the concept of media as a shield comes into focus. When institutions choose not to fully clarify something, they often rely, consciously or not, on the media's reluctance to push too hard. The result is a kind of mutual quiet, not a conspiracy, a convergence. Everyone understands, without needing to say it out loud, that this is not a story to escalate. And so it isn't. Instead, coverage shifts to safer ground, to themes of resilience, of harassment, of victimhood, all real, all valid, but also strategically effective at redirecting attention. The original questions don't get answered. They just stop being asked. That's how narratives are insulated. What's striking here is how durable that insulation was. For years, the topic remained frozen. Not resolved, just dormant. And dormancy can be mistaken for closure. But closure requires explanation. Dormancy just requires fatigue. Then, slowly something changed. Not in the headlines, but in the background. As trust in institutions eroded more broadly, journalists began revisiting old assumptions. Stories that had once felt settled were reopened. Not because new evidence emerged, but because the cultural appetite shifted. People started asking process questions again. How do we know? Who verified this? What standards were applied? And when those questions resurfaced in this context, the old defenses didn't work as well. Calling people cruel didn't address procedural gaps. Calling people conspiratorial didn't explain missing documentation. So the strategy adjusted again. Coverage didn't confront the questions head-on. It reframed them as irrelevant, as distractions from more important conversations. That's another subtle move. When you can't discredit a question, you can minimize it. And that's what happened here. The topic wasn't denied. It was deprioritized. But deprioritization doesn't erase uncertainty. It just pushes it to the margins, where it can simmer. This is also where the intelligence dimension quietly intersects with media behavior. Organizations like MI5 and MI6 don't need to manage media narratives directly. They understand that media systems will often self-regulate when the stakes feel high enough. All they have to do is avoid definitive statements. Ambiguity does the rest. Journalists fill the vacuum with caution. Editors weigh risk. Producers decide not to book certain guests. Stories get pitched and then quietly shelved. Not because someone ordered it, because everyone senses the boundary. And boundaries, once sensed, are rarely tested aggressively unless someone is prepared to accept the consequences. This is why the absence of a clear institutional shutdown matters so much. If a definitive denial had been issued early, clean, procedural, unemotional, it would have given media cover to move on confidently. Instead, what existed was a gray zone. And gray zones are where stories linger, half alive. It's also worth noting who benefited from that gray zone. Not individuals, necessarily. Systems. Systems that prefer stability over clarity. Systems that assume time will soften interest. And for a long while, they were right. But time doesn't just dull curiosity. It also changes perspective. New journalists come in without the same emotional investment, without the same fear of reputational blowback. They look at old files and ask simple questions that were once considered impolite. Why was this never fully clarified? Why did the narrative rely so heavily on trust? Why were procedural questions treated as attacks? Those are not hostile questions. They're foundational ones. And when they resurface, the old narrative shields start to look thin. That's when institutions face a choice. Do you finally clarify, risking that the clarification itself opens new lines of inquiry? Or do you continue to rely on the fact that most people will still choose the path of least resistance? So far, the latter approach has held. But it's fragile. Because once people realize that a topic has been protected not by facts, but by framing, the framing loses power. And when framing loses power, attention returns to fundamentals, records, processes, verification, which brings us back to the core tension of this entire story. Not whether a shocking claim is true, but whether the systems designed to resolve doubt were ever fully engaged in the first place. And if they weren't, the question becomes why. That's not something media narratives can answer. That's something institutions eventually have to confront. And when they do, because at that point, silence stops being protective. It becomes risky. And that's when stories like this either finally resolve or fracture in ways no one fully controls. But the signs of that fracture don't appear on front pages. They appear in who steps back, in who stops speaking, and in who suddenly becomes very careful about what they're willing to stand behind. And that's where the next turn begins. Silence is not neutral. It never is. At a certain point, silence becomes a position. And once it becomes a position, it can be evaluated like any other strategic choice, by its risks, its benefits, and the pressure it creates over time. That's where this story quietly moves next. Not toward outrage, not toward proof, not toward spectacle, toward consequence. Because institutions can tolerate uncertainty for a while. They can manage ambiguity. They can let narratives float as long as those narratives don't force action. But when doubt becomes persistent, when it refuses to fade, when it starts showing up in places it shouldn't, that tolerance wears thin, and something shifts. You don't see it immediately. There's no announcement, no memo leaked to the press, just subtle changes in behavior. Who is willing to speak? Who suddenly isn't? Who hedges where they once sounded confident? Those are the early indicators that an issue has moved from manageable to uncomfortable. This is where intelligence culture becomes relevant again. Not in the sensational way people imagine, but in the procedural way few ever notice. Organizations like MI5 and MI6 are not built to chase headlines. They're built to reduce exposure, to anticipate second and third-order effects. They don't ask, is this embarrassing? They ask, what happens if this is exploited? And exploitation doesn't require certainty. It requires doubt that can't be closed. That's the threshold we're circling now. At some point, internally, questions begin to change. Not, is this claim true? But what if someone else claims it is, and we can't disprove it cleanly? That's a very different problem. Because once an institution recognizes that it may lack a definitive counter, it has to reassess its posture. Not publicly, internally. This is when reviews happen. Quiet ones. Reviews that don't seek to assign blame, but to map risk. What do we have on record? What assumptions were made? What decisions relied on trust rather than verification? And crucially, if we were challenged tomorrow, how confident are we in our answers? Those reviews are not accusatory. They're pragmatic. And they often lead to one uncomfortable realization. That some issues were handled with the expectation they would never be revisited. That's not incompetence. It's normal. Institutions operate under time pressure, political pressure, human pressure. Decisions are made in context. But context changes. And when it does, yesterday's expediency becomes today's vulnerability. This is where people inside systems begin to distance themselves, not from the truth, but from ownership. You see it in language. Statements that once said, we can confirm, start saying, we understand. Positions that once sounded firm become, based on information available at the time. Those phrases are not accidental. They are legal and reputational cushions. They create room. Room to say, later, that things were believed, not verified. That's a subtle but critical distinction. Belief can be defended. Verification can be tested. And this distinction is where consequence quietly gathers. Because once an institution acknowledges, internally, even implicitly, that it believed rather than verified, it has to consider what that means for its credibility. Not just in this case. In all cases. That's why stories like this are so dangerous to systems. Not because of their content, but because of their precedent. If one high-profile event is revealed to have been handled with exceptional informality, it invites scrutiny of others. And institutions do not like precedent scrutiny. This is also where you start to see caution ripple outward. People who were once willing to speak on background stop returning calls. Officials who once framed things confidently defer to process. Legal teams become more visible in conversations where they weren't before. None of this proves anything happened. but it proves something is being considered. And consideration is the first step toward consequence. Another subtle shift appears in how related topics are treated. Adjacent issues suddenly get more formal handling. Protocols are emphasized. Verification language becomes more prominent. That's not coincidence. It's course correction. Institutions often learn indirectly. They don't always fix the original issue. They make sure it doesn't happen again, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. That whatever uncertainty exists here is now being managed as a legacy risk. Not something to resolve publicly, but something to contain going forward. That's a common strategy. And it works until it doesn't. Because legacy risks have a way of resurfacing when the people who manage them leave. New leadership asks new questions. New analysts don't accept old assurances. And suddenly, things that were understood have to be re-explained. That's when silence becomes fragile. Because silence relies on shared memory. Once that memory fades, the silence loses its anchor. This is where the story becomes less about any individual and more about time. Time passing, people changing, institutional knowledge thinning. At some point, someone new looks at the file and asks a very simple question. Why is this like this? And if there's no clean answer, the discomfort returns. That's where we may be headed. Not toward a dramatic revelation, but toward an erosion of confidence that forces clarification by necessity rather than choice. That's the real consequence institutions fear. Not scandal. Exposure. Exposure of process. Exposure of shortcuts. Exposure of decisions made under assumptions that no longer hold. And here's the irony. If everything was handled properly, exposure would be safe. If it wasn't, exposure becomes risky. Which means the reaction to exposure tells you more than any rumor ever could. So far, the reaction has been avoidance. Careful language. Narrative redirection. Reliance on moral framing. Those tools work for a while, but they don't age well. Because as soon as one person asks the question without the old emotional weight attached, the entire structure has to hold on its own. And if it can't, that's when things change. Not with a bang. With a slow, procedural unraveling that no one can quite stop once it begins. We're not there yet. But the signs, the subtle ones, are accumulating. And the next sign doesn't come from media or documents. It comes from people. From who is willing to vouch. From who hesitates. From who chooses their words.